Live. Hello, world. And this is our second episode of Angular Air, our episode 2. And with us we have Brian Ford from the Angular team. Say hi, Brian.
Hi, guys.
Super excited to have Brian. We're going to talk about AngularJS DevTools. And as always, my name is Kent C. Dodds, and my co-host, Todd Motto.
I'll do. Cool. So good to have you here, Brian.
It's good to be here.
We'll go through some quick general announcements, which we regurgitate every show. So this one's a little bit different. You might see if Kent pops his head up a little bit. We're both wearing some rather nice Angular t-shirts. These are actually from shirtjs.com. They're actually sponsoring this episode. We've got a moderator panel on our website. The best question we're going to give away. I think it might be a tie at the minute. So Brian, you might have to choose your favourite question. But they'll be getting a Angular top at the end of the show. So obviously this week we've got Brian. The next show we're not going to do one this year, so we'll kick off the new year in January. On the 13th, which I hope is not a Friday, with Ari Lerner. That'll be staying up to date with Angular. He's the author, of NG Book, so we'll tune in with him next year. You can ask us questions as we go on the show. We're probably going to be here for about an hour or so. ng-air.github.io, and feel free to tweet us anything or post anything on the Google Plus as we go along. We're keeping an eye on those. So let's kick into the main content. So for those of you who hopefully have heard of Brian, but who haven't heard of Brian, and use the AngularJS DevTools in Chrome, he actually created Batarang. You probably pronounce it slightly differently to me. So Brian, for those who haven't used Batarang, what is it and how can it kind of help Angular developers?
So Batarang is an extension that hooks into Chrome's DevTools and lets you kind of introspect Angular apps. And maybe that doesn't sound super exciting, but maybe I can actually just demo it right now. Let's see. How daring do we want to be?
Yeah. Well, you can totally demo it. That'd be awesome. For the visual viewers on YouTube, I think we get most of our traffic through YouTube. But there are a lot of people who listen to this, so as you're going through it, just say what you're doing.
All right, I'll keep that in mind. Just a moment. Find a good app to demo. Okay.
And while you're getting that set up, I'll just say that Batarang has been a huge asset to me in my development. Even just like one or two of the features of the previous version of Batarang were like huge and really helped me in my development. So go ahead and take it away.
All right, can you see that all right?
Yeah, maybe you could zoom in just a little bit.
All right.
Awesome.
Let's try that. So I'm looking at the AngularJS homepage here, and on the right side of the screen you can see Chrome DevTools. Batarang adds this additional tab here. So where normally you have elements, network sources, this adds an AngularJS kind of section as well. And so then what you can do is you can scroll through here, you can see the different scopes, kind of what's responsible for each scope. You can click on it and then see various models in here. And then you can actually even edit this. I think that this goes to the bottom of the screen here, so maybe you can see this, but this says 137 leaky obstruction, so you can actually just click on this model and mess with it, and then you see it updates down there.
Oh, wow, that's way cool.
That's kind of the long story short. That's the interesting thing in there right now. There's another section here that tries and gives you kind of best practices guidelines, and I guess I can talk a little bit more about that as well, but visually it's not super interesting. So that's the 30-second version of Batarang.
Cool. I think another feature, and I believe this is still in the new version, is being able to just choose an element and then your dollar scope in the console is bound to the scope of that element. Is that right?
Yeah, that is. Here, let me do that really quickly. So if you go over to the Elements pane, maybe you want to look at this section here, which I think it's loaded in by like an ng include or something, right? So you have this show and hide, and you can actually just do dollar scope, and this gives you the Angular scope. And scroll a little bit. You can make changes to this just like you would something else. Let's see if there's nothing super interesting on this scope. Let's go back to inspecting this right here because I know that there's an interesting model on it. So if we do scope again, and this, you can see all of the different things on here. So you can see, for instance, version. So we could do $scope, $apply, version equals hello.
Cool.
You see this update. So it does that as well. Let me think. You can actually also look at scopes here in this side panel. So again, you have like styles, event listeners, down breakpoints. This is another pane in the side panel here. So as you're going through different elements in here, you can inspect it. So again, that's just one of the features, but the idea is to let you kind of dig into your Angular app in real time and see what's actually going on. There are all sorts of other tools that you might use in a workflow, like like a linter, like JSHint or JSHint. But those don't help you kind of as you're writing your app. Like dynamically instrument and look into it, and so Batarang kind of tries to fill that gap.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Yeah, I think that $scope in the console and those properties, that scope properties pane in the Elements tab, have been probably the most helpful for me in the stuff that I've done, and I'm really excited to get into the new version of Batarang. And like as the Angular hints matures further, and being able to like analyze my watchers. I know you've got some stuff in the pipeline for that too, right? To identify bottleneck watchers. I think it's just going to help us further, so it's way cool.
Yeah, and my hope is that this will allow developers to not only like find issues in like the logic of their app, but also find performance bottlenecks and also find places where you're not adhering to best practices, or where maybe you could organize things a little bit better. So kind of proactively show developers better ways to do things as they're writing their app. Kind of the traditional way to deal with best practices is you have a document somewhere and it's kind of a long list of trivia. And I find that really tedious to go through. You don't necessarily know which pieces are important at what time, and it's just kind of a mess. So the idea that I'm trying to implement with Angular Hint is to kind of give developers just the right information at the right time as they're working on something.
Cool. Yeah. So how did Batarang start? Like, what prompted building Batarang, and did you build it yourself?
Yeah. So Batarang actually started when I was an intern at Google a couple summers ago. When was that? 2 years ago now, maybe. And it was Igor Minar, who I think was on your show earlier. But he also works at Google and Angular, and it was his idea to build something like this. So he gave me kind of a couple high-level goals, and then I built it up from there. And yeah, so far, almost all of the work on Batarang has been me. There have been a couple one-off contributors, but I'm really hoping now that I'm branching out and working on so many different things that I can get more help. So there's actually a call for additional maintainers. If you're interested on working on a tool like this, check out the GitHub. It's on AngularJS Batarang. I'm sure you guys can link it somewhere in the notes for this. So yeah, basically up until now, we're working on it.
Yeah, we'll definitely put a link to that issue so people can sign up to help out. That'd be awesome.
So were there any? I know it's quite complex.
All right.
Are we in sync, or are we lagging slightly? Obviously, traversing the scopes and stuff. Were there any kind of difficulties with hooking into Angular? Because, like, I know that one of the older versions, you had the big repeat list of all the nested scopes. I mean, that must have been quite difficult from a starting. Well, maybe not for you because you know it inside out. But were there any kind of difficulties with that? It's kind of rendering and displaying, keeping things up to date with the new version as well.
Yeah, I think the most difficult thing is managing all of the state, and the way that Chrome extensions are written is that everything kind of lives in its own separate VM, its own separate JavaScript context. And so what happens is you're allowed to share the DOM with what's called a content script, and then content scripts can communicate to background pages, and the Chrome extension pane can also communicate to background pages. So what you end up with is this long chain of you have to emit events from your app to the content script, have the content script send it to the background page, and then the background page forward this information to the DevTools pane. And so what you end up with is a couple different levels of kind of caches and message passing, and a couple places where you might need to hold state. And so if you don't have a sane strategy for that, which took me a very long time to get something even approaching sane, until you have that, you get all sorts of weird behavior depending on the order that, maybe you open up your app, then you refresh your app, then you open up the DevTools pane, and in that case you have to make sure that you clear off cache between the refresh, but that you don't flush the cache before the DevTools pane connects, and there's just a lot of, you can think of it sort of as an elaborate state machine, and so you just have to be very methodical about the order that everything can happen. So there's that. There's also the trick of making everything work efficiently. So the first version of Batarang actually serialized each scope that was inspected and sent the whole thing down the pipe. So this is fine for small apps, but if you have an array on your scope that has 1 million elements, right, that doesn't perform very well. And this was actually one of the reasons that I recently rewrote it. The new version now kind of incrementally tracks which things you're looking at, and then it'll only send you updates on those particular things. And so then that ends up being much, much faster. Mm-hmm. It's a little tricky because you also have to hook into the digest cycle, and you have to make sure that all of your functions are very, very efficient, because that ends up being a pretty hot code path. But you can actually take a look at the code. It's interesting because it uses this sort of decorator pattern. So it grabs a hold of the root scope and then patches a couple APIs on there, so we can keep track of things like when is a digest cycle happening, and when is a new scope created, and when is the scope destroyed. And then you hook into those sort of events and those APIs, and you can see when you need to send certain information to the DevTools pane in order to keep the two things in sync.
Interesting. I'll have to look at that because I know I built ng-stats to kind of help diagnose your watching and your digest cycles, like the length of your digest cycle. And I had to do funny things to hijack the root scope so that I would be able to hijack the digest.
Yeah, so, yeah, look at that actually, and I think we're using the same technique, if not very, very similar ones.
Oh, cool. Yeah, it works, and it's been helpful for me at least, so that's cool. That's awesome. It sounds like building a Chrome extension like Batarang, it can be a little bit hairy in some ways.
Yeah, I'm not super happy with the APIs that Chrome gives developers to write extensions. Like, I really think that there's probably just a handful of different cases, and maybe the API could really be more optimized for these certain things, where you say, oh, I have a one-way channel from this context to this context, just set it up for me. But once you get your head around it, it's not too bad. It's just managing all the different contexts, and even the names of the different APIs are not super kind of conducive to helping you understand this. You have things like Chrome runtime versus Chrome extension versus and which of these hooks up to the background page, and which of these hooks up to content scripts, and like where the messages are coming from. It's not entirely obvious from the API. So I do wish that this was a little bit better, just for other people writing these extensions. But I do think Batarang is probably on the more complex end of this. So if you're thinking of writing a Chrome extension that does something similar, take a look at it, and if you come up with something better, let me know.
PRs for the win. Yeah, actually, that made me think of another question. So, has there been any thought to Firefox, and if there'd be space for a Firefox extension, or yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
That's an excellent question. That's something that I would really, really like to do. And actually, there was a PR maybe several months ago that someone ported the extension to Firefox. It's a little bit more work to kind of build on both of them, and then also to be running tests on both of them. Actually, even just testing a Chrome extension is somewhat difficult right now. I have to build up a custom profile, and then there's some hacks with WebDriver in order to get that running. So I don't know. I'll see. But the important thing for me is that if I'm going to publish from the same source space, like a Firefox version and a Chrome version, I want them both to be very, very testable, and to really know that they both work in each environment. So we'll see. I would really, really like to do it, but it's not something that I'm immediately working on now.
Well, I just for our listeners and viewers, if that's something that you're really interested in, then PRs are welcome, and thumbs up on an issue is probably also handy too, to know what the demand is, I would imagine, right?
Yeah, for sure. But it's not the important thing to note, though, is that this isn't something where you just port the code and then it's done. It's something where I want to make sure that we're building from the same source code, and it's easy to roll out updates, and it's easy to kind of catch discrepancies between Firefox and Chrome. So really, like, the infrastructure is the hard part. The porting and making it work in both browser environments, it actually should be fairly easy. Actually, all of the instrumentation code I run against Firefox and Chrome and Safari. So I'm already confident that almost all of the code in Batarang works in each environment. It's just getting kind of the integration level test in Firefox. I'm not quite sure how to do that.
Cool. I'm not sure there's a nice way to ask this, but have you had any recent troubles with any versions that have rolled out?
That's a very good question. Actually, it turns out it's a coincidence, but yes. When I actually rolled out the kind of rewrite that had the different instrumentation, there was an issue where the instrumentation was turned on by default, and there were some cases that in live apps the new instrumentation didn't handle very well. So what this resulted in is, like, anyone using Batarang got an update that just broke a handful of Angular apps. So I tried to follow up as quickly as I could to fix that, but this was kind of a huge oversight on my part. One of the reasons actually that I kind of am stressing this improvement to the testing is that probably the past week I've really been trying to make sure that I'm not only running kind of unit level tests and even integration tests against, like, fixture Angular apps, but also that new versions of Batarang are tested against, like, live Angular apps, like the Angular documentation, and like the Virgin American Airlines website uses Angular, and there are a couple other big ones. And so just doing something like loading the instrumentation code in a browser that has a large Angular app and making sure that a couple basic features still run well, that actually goes a really long way in preventing these sort of issues. So yes, it's all of that is fixed now. Not just the issue where instrumentation is on by default, but also the issues in the instrumentation that cause these apps to fail should more or less be finished. If you ever encounter any difficulties with Batarang, or if there's some app that crashes with it, I'd be really, really happy to get an issue on GitHub, especially an issue with a link to an app or some sort of reproduction. That really helps me. I can usually roll out a fix sometime that day if I have something that I can work off of.
No, that's cool.
Yeah,
we found out.
I was just gonna. Sorry, dude.
Go on,
just say that the app was rolled out. It broke an app that I'm building, and so I posted something on GitHub, and then I noticed there were quite a few issues getting posted, and I just wanted to say thank you, and I was really impressed with your ability to address those issues really quickly, and so that people's apps weren't broken. Just a general thank you for building the thing, because you build this thing and make it available for free, and tons and tons of people benefit, and so yeah, just really grateful for the work that you do. So yeah, that's awesome. Thanks.
Oh, you're very welcome, and it's a lot of fun for me to get to work on projects like this, actually. So it's a win-win for everyone.
And hopefully nobody's sat there going, that's why my app was broken. We found out after about an hour of debugging, I was like, maybe I'll just disable this. Oh my god, my app works. So sadly there were no errors or anything in the console, so yeah. We worked it out though, but maybe someone's watching and that was the problem with their app. But cool. So we also saw Angular Hint sneak in there as well. Is that going to be kind of in there ongoing, or do you? I think can you include it as a module as well, as an ng module?
Yeah. So there are actually a couple different ways that you can use Angular Hint. Kind of my goal was to make it as easy as possible for newcomers to Angular to use. So that's one of the reasons that it's kind of embedded in Batarang. But it's kind of an instrumentation framework, you can say. That is more modular and that lets you load specific runtime checks into Angular. So right now Batarang only uses kind of a subset of its features, just because I haven't proven out in kind of a larger sense that all of this stuff, when it's instrumented, performs well and doesn't cause issues for end users. But again, the idea is to give more real-time feedback. So one of the features is that it can detect if you're kind of doing DOM manipulation in some way that you shouldn't. So kind of a classic beginner mistake in Angular is you're chugging right along, building your app, and you encounter something where it's not obvious that there's a directive that you can use. And so what you do is in your controller you grab some element, or you document query selector, or use jQuery, or what have you, and then you start making changes to the DOM in there. And kind of, I think one of the more interesting features is that we can detect these sort of things. So if inside your controller code you're touching something that's a DOM element, we can say, hey, this line right here where you're doing this, you might consider doing something else instead. And so this is really good for developers who, maybe they've read a couple tutorials, and Angular is pretty powerful, so you can really get started right off the bat. But they don't necessarily have some idea of where to direct their learnings, or what part of the documentation is relevant to them, or even what APIs are available. Some of the other things that I can do is, let's say you're typing ng controller and you typo on controller. Normally what would happen is you would have this app where just whatever controller functionality you'd put in there just wouldn't happen, and it would be mysterious and broken, and there's no error message because HTML will accept whatever attributes you throw at it. And so there's something that hooks into Angular's compiler and says, oh, this attribute looks like a directive, but it's not quite, it doesn't quite match. And so it can say, this element right here, you typed this, did you mean something else?
Well, that's good. So there's
So what?
Go on.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
You went a bit fuzzy there.
Okay, I was just gonna ask, what does Angular Hint support currently? I I imagine the list is probably a little deep. Is there like things that you could list off that?
So I think the question before you started to cut off was what browsers does it support? So I test against kind of modern-ish browsers. I think I'm actually a couple versions behind on Chrome and Firefox and Safari. But it would be, I'm targeting browsers that you'd want to develop in. I haven't run tests against IE, and I actually hear that the DevTools in newer versions of IE are quite improved. So I might start doing that as well. If you notice that it doesn't work in a browser, let me know. And if you notice that the tests aren't run against a browser that you'd like to develop in, let me know. The high-level thing is that I don't want to support IE8 or support really old versions of Angular because AngularJS is a development tool. It's not something that you'd include in your final app. It gives you additional notifications to teach you things as you're developing, or to catch simple mistakes that it's really easy to gloss over as you're typing a million different things and managing all these different things.
Who was it
Sorry.
who defined?
I think my question was more about not browser support, but like what hints are available. Like what are some of the things that it warns you against?
Oh, that's a good question. So besides what I've already mentioned, there's also a module that will warn you about module names. So let's say you include Angular-resource in your app. But you never include it as, you never include ng-resource, the module, as a dependency in your application. When that application bootstraps, it'll say, oh, I noticed that there were these other modules available that you didn't actually include in your app, that they're unused. So you should either, you might want to get rid of them because they might be dead code weight. They might be, something that you legitimately forgot to put in, and at some point a controller is going to get instantiated, ask for $resource, and throw this error. There's that. There's something that checks against interpolations and against the ng event directives, so things like ng-click. So if you do ng-click equals a.b.c function call, you might have a.b defined, but b might not have a method c. And so when you click on it, Angular is forgiving. And this is almost always what you want in an app where you might be dynamically loading things. When you're developing, it's nice to know why some expression wasn't able to actually be invoked. So one thing that it can do is it can tell you, oh, a.b exists, but c doesn't, or it can give you some insight into that, into why something didn't fire, or to why something wasn't interpolated. Let's see. Let me actually check here.
Just one in particular, Brian, was one of the biggest challenges. I work with some who are typically front-end developers, and they're helping me out with the front-end development. And one of the struggles that I see that they have a lot of the time, and even that I have a lot of the time, is debugging Angular's DSL, like the template language itself. And so like having hints that say, oh, this ng-click didn't work because this thing wasn't defined, or there's something wrong with this expression potentially. Like that is a huge win. So I'm looking forward to being able to use AngularJS a little bit more for stuff like that. So that's way cool.
Yeah, and then there are also a bunch around kind of best practices and naming conventions. And these are a little tricky because right now everyone has different ideas about what good naming conventions are. But my hope is that this is something where we can kind of nail down what the best practices are, and then kind of proactively give people hints as they're learning.
Yeah, that's way cool too, because like after some time, everybody kind of joining together and saying, okay, these are the conventions we're going to follow. Like follow the style guide, and then AngularJS kind of shepherding people toward that style guide. Then I can jump into somebody else's app and start being productive right away. I think that's a huge win. So cool. So sorry, was there any other else that you wanted to mention, Brian?
No, I mean, I think there are probably dozens of other individual checks, but at a high level, that's the idea. These are the sort of things that I want to resolve for developers.
Cool. Okay, so I guess we can move on to the. Go ahead, Todd.
2.0. Everybody's waiting for it. Go on, Kent. You can dive in.
We wanted to ask you about what Angular 2.0 DevTools would look like, or any concepts or ideas for DevTools for the next version of Angular.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not yet entirely sure what Angular 2 will look like. No one is quite entirely sure. I certainly want at least the sort of things that exist in Batarang today. My hope, and again, like, this is not concrete, but my hope is that DevTools can also pave the way for migration. So one of the sites that I think it'll make it really easy to migrate around is the router. And actually, this router that I'm working on it'll have bindings in both Angular 1 and Angular 2. So kind of the migration path that I have in mind for new apps is, or for existing Angular 1 apps, is that you'll kind of migrate onto this new router that'll help improve code structure and help around kind of best practices, and in some cases even start to semantically align you with Angular 2. And then from there, it's pretty easy to switch from the router being an Angular 1 app router to being an Angular 2 app router, where in Angular 2, you just actually have a bunch of Angular 1 apps that you're routing to. And then from there, you can slowly transition each component to be an Angular 2 component. So that's kind of what I have in mind. Again, it's not something that you should quote me on because Angular 2 doesn't exist yet, and there's still a lot of exploratory work to do around that. But at least so far, this seems like the path forward for people that want to migrate to Angular 2. So I want tools that help you migrate to that. I think a lot of the tools will be around introspecting into routing, because that will be kind of a key site for people moving between different versions. And again, like, I can't make any promises on that. There's a lot of toss-up on Angular 2. If you want to kind of track the progress of it or make sure that Angular 2 is really serving your best interests, the best thing to do is to hop on GitHub. We have a repo Angular/Angular, different from Angular/Angular.js. But in that repo, that's the current version of what will become Angular 2. And there are all sorts of issues and use cases and kind of different proposals and musings and ideas around what will go into that. So again, if you're concerned, or if you have this brilliant idea that needs to be in Angular 2, that's where you want to go.
That was the first time, and like you said, this isn't concrete, but that was the first time that I've heard any hint of what a migration path might look like for Angular 2. And it actually, like, I've been a little bit concerned, like, I don't know how you're possibly going to do this, but using the router to say, okay, this little thing is an Angular 1 piece and this piece is an Angular 2 piece, like, that actually sort of makes sense. So I hope, obviously, like, we have no idea what the migration path would look like, but that does sound sane. It sounds like kind of a reasonable thing to do. So yeah, just looking forward to further, I guess, information about what that will look like, and further tools that will help make that happen.
Right, and this is actually not like a new idea of kind of using the routing system as something to transition. Like, we have apps like Google that were written with Gwt, and they sort of Google Web Toolkit, GWT. It's the crazy thing that takes Java code and writes UI web stuff. But some apps actually have kind of a special routing system that allows them to, that was built so that way they could go between these different things. So there's some prior art there in using this as a technique to do this. So that's why I think it seems likely. And I've been talking with with engineers at Google and engineers outside of Google, and it seems like a good strategy. So again, I don't want to put anything in stone, but it's something to look forward to. And if you have an app and you're interested in this sort of strategy, get in contact with me. GitHub is probably the best way, just that way we can keep conversation in the open and bounce ideas across all sorts of interested parties. But yeah, it's pretty exciting. It's exciting to work on, and I think it'll be exciting if you're a developer writing it as well.
Cool. Okay, so we had more of an open-ended question, and this is a little less about Batarang and more about Angular development in general. But what are some cool things that you've seen others do or done yourself that helps developers be more productive when developing Angular applications?
So for me, the most important thing when writing an app is that you want to make it easy for others to collaborate. And for me, the best way to do that is to have good tests. So probably one of the first things for me is making sure that my testing infrastructure is set up. I think there are some tools like Yeoman or various seeds that kind of come pre-configured with the latest versions of Karma, and they're already hooked up to do continuous integration on Travis CI. But those are really big things for me. I used to be really into linters and tools like that. I'm not super into that anymore. I think it's useful for larger projects. Smaller ones, not necessarily so much. Depending on the sort of project that you're doing, like if you're starting from scratch, for instance, you might look into using something like Tracer, which, if you're not familiar with it, it compiles ES6 code to ES5, so it lets you use tomorrow's JavaScript with today's browsers, and that's a really cool tool. It has a bunch of various niceties, but one of the things that's exciting about it is we're building Angular 2 on top of it. So you can write your app however you want, but Angular inside is developed with ES6. So it's cool in that you could learn that, and then you could help write the code for Angular 2 if you wanted to.
Yeah, well, and writing in ES6 is awesome. I've had the pleasure of doing it in like JSBin, but not in an actual project. I'm hoping to do that. So actually, one thing that I wanted to mention, something that I've done that helps me with Angular development, is there are a lot of handy like just short functions that you can write that just help you in your development. Like I want to find the scope for this one particular thing, and I know that it has a property named this, and so instead of like going through Batarang, like clicking on an element and then choosing like, does this have that property I'm looking for? Like you just write a function that will iterate through all the scopes and return the ones that have the property that you're looking for, or if you want to find, okay, I've got this scope, what element is that scope on? Like you can do different things like that. And so I've built, and maybe I should open source this, but I've built a file that just has a bunch of helper functions, and I load that in development. And so like I've got my build ignores anything that has .exclude anything. So I have like dev.exclude.js. And so it gets included during development, but excluded when it's actually built. And so then I can put all of my helper functions in there to, like help me when I'm developing, like iterate scopes, like do this thing to all the scopes, and find the right scope that I'm looking for, or something, or get the element by scope ID, like different things like that. So I've just recently started doing this, and it's been super helpful to just have scripts pre-loaded in development, or even like I never type in the username and password when I'm in development when I need to log in. Like that fills in for me, and because I've got this script. Like if I need to test that page, then I'll turn that off and I'll test that page. But otherwise, it just logs in for me. And it's super helpful. So there are a lot of things that you can do. I think maybe just like in JavaScript in general, if you just like include a script on the page. Yeah, so that was just one thing that I wanted to mention that like I'll definitely do for all projects that I have in the future.
Yeah, actually, both of the things, well, not both of you mentioned a couple things, but the first two things that you mentioned, there's actually pending tasks to add this to Batarang. So a search feature where you can search for a model and it'll find the scope that has it, and then also right-click on a scope in that inspector and go to the corresponding element. Yeah, both of these things are things that I'm working on or want to add to Batarang at some point. I think the helper functions, that's really interesting. Much like Batarang exposes $scope, maybe there could be an option for it to expose these things as well. So you should definitely open source that and maybe file an issue for me to look into that. That sounds really cool.
Yeah, actually, I think there is an issue open right now for like one of the things that I do as well is once I have a handle on the injector, I'll set a couple of my factories on window, and so then I can just say account.do this thing and make a request without having to or I even put the injector on window in development, and so I can do a bunch of really handy things, which you can do without doing that. I can get the injector, and then from there it's just whatever. But having this loaded like automatically and like putting something like that into Batarang would be way cool, because then you could just say, on this website, here are a couple of factories that I want on window, so I can just like do whatever I want.
Right. More generally, in Chrome DevTools, there are actually a bunch of places where you can right-click some identifier and say store as a global variable, and so then it'll set like temp1 or temp2 in your console, and you can interact with that object. So like this is something that I use more generally in JavaScript, but I think this is something that Batarang could even help you out with more as well. Kind of as an addendum to that, like learning the Chrome DevTools or the Firefox DevTools really well, and like knowing what things are out there, knowing how to step through code. I think that's it's a big win for Angular, but it's also a big win for any JavaScript you write or any front end kind of stuff that you're dealing with.
Yeah, I found out recently that I'm a Firefox noob, and I should probably learn Firefox DevTools. I don't know my way around those DevTools, so gotta be better at that.
Yeah, I've heard very, very good things about recent updates to Firefox's DevTools. So if you're almost always on Chrome, I would definitely encourage you to check that out as well.
Cool. Should we one more question, or we move on to the questions?
Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about, Brian?
No, that's pretty much all that I had.
Nothing up this to do.
Awesome. Yeah, let's move on to the questions then.
Cool. Okay. So I know you mentioned the new router/router earlier. One of these I'm quite interested in as well is how will the new router compare to UI router? I mean, there's probably some ideas. I know you mentioned previous art, and I've had a look in the 2.0 drive. I think it'd be quite interesting to see how the new router comes back to like 1.3, that kind of branch.
Right, so I can't do an in-depth comparison. I spoke, and actually the requirements document that outlines what things should be in the new router was co-authored by two of the gentlemen who work on UI router. So the idea is be able to capture all of the use cases that UI router accounts for, but then also start to align with Angular 2 semantics for components. There are a couple explicit cases that I want to do a better job of. So for instance, things on mobile devices. I want a better story for animating between different panes or reusing different views. There's kind of this idea of this asynchronous pipeline. So it's almost like a middleware-like idea. So you can kind of plug in different layers and use this to do auth, or use this to implement permissions. So how it compares is you should be able to do everything in the new router that you also do in the UI router. but there are some kind of higher level semantic differences. And to be totally honest, I'm not familiar enough with the API of UI Router to tell you at like an API level exactly how the two differ. But one thing that I'm doing as I'm making this router is I'm building small apps that each they act as an end-to-end test for some particular feature, but also they let me see what the API feels like in some case. So you can take a look at each of these cases, like how do I do animations with a new router? How do I do a hierarchy of routes in a new router? How do I handle preventing someone from navigating away from a certain thing in a new router? Each of these things I want to be as part of the documentation, but also kind of runnable example apps. So as I build that out, I think you'll be able to compare a little bit better.
Is there a...
Those are available on your GitHub?
Yeah, if you go github.com /angular/router, you can start to see some of that work. I don't have quite all of it pushed yet, but there's an examples folder that has an Angular 1 and Angular 2 section, so you can start to see how you write your controllers and how you build up components, and then how you configure the router and how it interacts in different ways. I guess one other additional thing is that one of the goals of the new router is that you can build out almost sub-applications where each level of routing can stand on its own without any really additional configuration. So you might build something like a control panel or a login part of your app, and then you can share this part of this like routable component and just plug it in different places in an app. So it should be seamless to take foo/bar/users, this last users bit that has kind of a rich behavior around looking at profiles or pictures or something, and move that somewhere else in your app just by changing the configuration of its parent component. This is another thing. So again, just getting you better reuse and better making it so that we can actually share some of these components.
Cool. So another question, and actually this is the top question. So these Olivier Combe, I hope I said your name right. But I think he's by far the winner of that T-shirt. But his question is, are you working on new CLI tools for Angular 2? And I'm not totally sure. I totally get that, but maybe you understand what he's asking.
Sure. So at the moment, I am not actively working on CLI tools for Angular 2. There is some group working on this. I'm not super involved with it, but I know that this is something that we want. So I had worked on Yeoman a bit in the past, and it's a pretty good solution, but I think it suffers from some issues of making things compose together well, and perhaps trying to be overly ambitious in trying to tackle all web applications. So there is some work being done right now on just trying to define the problem and trying to figure out what such a tool would look like, but I'm not super involved with that. If you're interested in this, reach out to me and I can put you in touch with probably Igor, who's kind of spearheading this new CLI tool.
Cool.
I'm waiting for you to speak.
I was like, Todd. I asked the last question.
We seem to be overlapping in this one. So zone.js. Any notes? What happened to zone.js?
Any notes on anyone using it, or?
I think he means what happened to it. I guess maybe.
Oh, what happened
You
to
just
it?
haven't heard about it, or I don't know.
Yeah, I haven't been actively developing it too much, mostly because it's more or less done. There are a couple API surfaces that might need to be smoothed over a little bit. There are some browser environments that have since updated that I probably need to update the kind of code that patches all of the async things in the browser. But actually, I think just a couple days ago we landed in our Angular 2 repo the support for Angular 2 to use zones, so it hooks into the change detection and all of that. And it seems to be working so far. So I'm sure that the work that Victor, another gentleman who works on Angular, I'm sure that the work that he's doing is going to inform more work on zones in the future. But the reason that there hasn't been too much work on it is just that for the time being, it was more or less done, and there wasn't a lot on Angular 2 up until just now that could kind of inform future work on that. So it's still something that I'm very much interested in and still very much interested in supporting. And if you have issues, please file it against it. But you'll probably see more active changes to that in the very near future.
Cool. No, that sounds good.
Cool. All right, so Todd, should we ask this last question, or are we all finished?
It's up to you.
Okay.
So it might benefit.
Yeah, so this last question, I don't know who's using Eclipse to develop Angular, but I would highly recommend you use anything else. But the question is, can you suggest some good Eclipse plugin that I can use to develop an Angular app? So I don't know if you know of anything, Brian, but I certainly couldn't recommend anything except don't use Eclipse.
So Eclipse is not my favorite piece of software, but I wouldn't be surprised if someone out there has written something. I don't have any experience using Eclipse with Angular, but you know what? If that's your thing and you like Eclipse and you want something that helps you out with Angular, I'm not sure what sort of tool you have in mind. But if it's not there, you should make it, because I'm sure that there are other developers out there using Eclipse kind of as their full IDE for all of their work, and they would probably appreciate that.
Yeah, cool. I like that that positive, build it. That's great. Yeah, that's awesome. And if you are listening to this and you're using Eclipse and you're like, well, what should I use instead? We should at least recommend stuff. So I'll recommend my favorite IDE is WebStorm from JetBrains. It's awesome. So I don't know what you guys use for your development.
I'm a Sublime at the minute.
Yeah, either Atom or Sublime, or every once in a while Vim. But WebStorm is very, very good, and it has great support for Angular. So if you're on Eclipse, I think WebStorm is probably the closest of all the options that we mentioned. It feels much closer to Eclipse in terms of the feature set.
But it's a bit fast.
Yeah. Cool. All right, so that's our questions. Like that, the winner was Ollie of the Air, I think is how you say that, Combe. But email us at angularair@gmail.com, and we'll get you the information that you need to get your shirt from Shirt.js. And we're super glad for everybody who participated and asking questions. There were questions, and definitely a huge thank you to Shirt.js for sponsoring us.
Yeah, definitely check them out, shirtjs.com. They got some smart t-shirts. I would say I'd go and get an Angular one, but I've already got one. So thanks for that. Olivier, I think the only thing you need to do is to tweet us a picture when you get the shirt.
All right, so I guess we're about wrapped up. I just want to, I think we do have a couple closing announcements. I guess, Todd, you take those away.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, we've done the thank you to shirtjs.com. Thank you. One thank you for each shirt. Next show, as I said at the beginning, is not in a couple of weeks. It's going to be in a couple of weeks and then a couple of weeks. So we're back on 13th of January with Ari Lerner, I think I said his name right, author of NG Book. So 13th of January, 2015. Where's this year gone? The info is already up on the website, ng-air.github.io. You can start leaving questions already. I think there might be one or two, hopefully. And in the meantime, you can visit the Google Plus page for this episode. Leave any comments, any feedback, say hey to Brian, maybe leave him some issue requests, and follow everybody on Twitter, including at AngularAir. We should probably, I think I've got it in mind. I think it's backwards. Yeah, there we go. Cool. So yeah, thanks a massive amount, Brian, for jumping on. It's been great to talk to you over here. So yeah, thanks from me.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah. Thanks everybody who watched and who will be listening, and we'll catch you all next year.
Happy holidays.
Happy holidays. Bye-bye.
See ya.
Bye.